The scream of a terrified horse cut through the afternoon air like a razor, sending every hand at the Morrison ranch running toward the corral. But Russell Harding got there first because he had been mending fence posts nearest to the commotion. What he saw when he rounded the corner made him freeze in his tracks, not from fear but from something else entirely, something that hit him square in the chest and knocked the breath clean out of his lungs. A chestnut mare, wild-eyed and frothing, reared up against the fence rails while a young woman stood perfectly still in the center of the corral, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders, and she was singing. The song was soft, almost impossible to hear over the horse's panicked whinnying, but Russell heard it clear as church bells on Sunday morning. Her voice carried a melody he did not recognize, something gentle and ancient, and the longer she sang, the more the mare's movements began to slow, her hooves finding the ground again, her ears swiveling forward to catch every note. Russell pressed himself against the fence post, unable to move, unable to look away, and in that moment, standing there covered in dust and sweat from a hard day's work, he felt his heart do something it had never done before. It simply gave itself away, completely and without question, to a woman whose name he did not even know. The year was 1892, and Cripple Creek, Colorado, was experiencing a gold rush that brought all manner of people flooding into the mountains. Russell had come 3 years prior, not for gold but for honest work as a ranch hand, having left Texas after his father died and the family land was sold to pay debts. He was 26 now, with strong hands and a quiet nature that made him good with animals and reliable in a crisis. The Morrison Ranch sat just outside town, sprawling across acres of rocky terrain where cattle grazed and horses were trained for sale to the mining operations that seemed to spring up overnight. He had never expected to see anything that would change his life on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, but there it was, happening right before his eyes. The mare finally stood still, trembling but calm, and the woman took a single step forward, still singing. Russell realized he was holding his breath. Other ranch hands had gathered behind him now, watching in silence as the scene unfolded. The horse lowered her head and the woman reached out slowly, her fingers just barely touching the mare's nose. The contact held. The song continued. Russell felt something tighten in his throat. "Who is that?" He whispered to Jack, the older hand standing beside him. "That is Miss Violet Morrison," Jack said quietly. "The boss's daughter. Just came back from Denver yesterday. Heard she was at some fancy school for young ladies." Russell's heart sank a little at that. The boss's daughter. Of course she would be someone completely out of his reach, someone who belonged to a different world than dusty corrals and calloused hands. But he could not tear his eyes away from her. She had stopped singing now and was stroking the mare's neck, murmuring words too soft to hear. The horse had relaxed completely, all the wild terror gone from her eyes. "That mare came in this morning from a ranch up north," Jack continued. "Been abused something terrible, kicked 2 men already. Boss was talking about putting her down, said she was too dangerous." But Violet Morrison clearly did not think so. She moved around the horse with careful confidence, checking her legs and running gentle hands over her flanks. Then she turned toward the fence, and for the first time, Russell got a good look at her face. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fancy dresses or carefully arranged hair. Her face was open and honest, with strong features and eyes that seemed to see everything. She was younger than him, probably around 22 or 23, but there was a steadiness about her that spoke of someone who knew her own mind. "Someone get me a blanket and some water," she called out, her voice clear and firm. "This horse needs care, not a bullet." The men scattered to do her bidding, and Russell found himself moving before his brain caught up with his body. He grabbed a bucket from the pump and filled it with fresh water, then found a clean horse blanket in the barn. When he returned to the corral, Violet was waiting by the gate. She looked at him directly, and Russell felt that strange tightness in his chest again. "Thank you," she said, taking the bucket and blanket from him. Her fingers brushed his for just a second, and Russell felt heat rush up his neck. "What is your name?" "Russell Harding, miss," he managed to say, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "Been working here about 2 years. Well, Russell Harding, would you mind helping me get this mare to the separate pen? She needs space away from the other horses while she settles." He nodded and climbed over the fence, moving slowly so as not to startle the horse. Violet had already slipped a rope halter over the mare's head, and together they led her toward a smaller enclosure on the far side of the barn. The horse went willingly enough, though she shied a bit when they passed too close to where some men were working. Violet immediately started singing again, that same soft melody, and the mare calmed instantly. "Where did you learn that song?" Russell asked once they had the horse settled and were walking back toward the main buildings. Violet smiled, and it transformed her whole face. "My mother taught it to me. She learned it from her mother, who was part Ute. It is a song for frightened things, meant to remind them that not everything in this world wants to hurt them." Russell thought about that as they walked. The afternoon sun was starting to lower, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Around them, men were finishing up their daily tasks, preparing for supper and the evening routine. Everything seemed normal, ordinary, but Russell felt like the entire world had shifted somehow, like he was seeing it all through new eyes. "Your father was planning to destroy that mare," he said, not sure why he was telling her this. "Before you arrived." Violet's expression darkened. "My father sees horses as equipment, as things to be used and discarded when they no longer serve a purpose. I see them differently." She paused, then looked at him with those clear, assessing eyes. "What do you see, Russell Harding?" No one had ever asked him a question like that before. He considered it carefully, wanting to give her an honest answer. "I see living creatures that deserve respect," he said finally. "I see animals that will give you everything they have if you treat them right. I see partners, not property." The smile that spread across Violet's face made his heart skip. "Then you and I are going to get along just fine," she said. Over the following days, Russell found himself drawn to the separate pen whenever he had a spare moment. Violet spent hours there working with the chestnut mare, and though he tried to tell himself he was just checking on the horse's progress, he knew the truth. He wanted to be near her. He wanted to hear her voice, watch the way she moved, see that focused expression she got when she was working through a problem. He had never felt this way about anyone before, and it terrified him as much as it thrilled him. Violet did not seem to mind his presence. In fact, she often asked for his help, requesting that he hold a rope or move a piece of equipment. They fell into an easy rhythm together, communicating with looks and small gestures as much as with words. The mare responded to their combined efforts, slowly learning to trust again. Violet named her Mercy, saying that everyone deserved a second chance at grace. "You have a gift with horses," Russell told her one evening as they watched Mercy roll in the dirt, a sign of contentment and relaxation. "I just listen to them," Violet replied. Most people do not bother to pay attention to what animals are trying to tell them. They assume horses are simple creatures without feelings or fears, but they are wrong. Horses are deeply emotional, deeply sensitive. They remember everything, especially pain. Russell thought about his own past, about the pain he carried from losing his family's land, from watching his father work himself to death trying to save something that could not be saved. People are like that too, he said quietly. Violet turned to look at him, really look at him, and he felt exposed in a way that should have made him uncomfortable but somehow did not. Yes, she said softly. They are. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken understanding. Then Violet's father called from the main house, his voice sharp with impatience, and the spell broke. Violet sighed, brushing dust from her split riding skirt, a practical garment that scandalized the town's more proper ladies. I should go, she said. He wants to discuss ranch business. As if I am supposed to know anything about profit margins and market prices. You were at school in Denver, Russell said. What did you study? Music and literature, mostly. The things young ladies are supposed to learn so they can be accomplished wives. Her tone carried an edge of bitterness. My father sent me there hoping I would come back refined and ready to marry someone suitable. Instead, I came back more certain than ever that I want something different from life. She walked away before Russell could respond, leaving him standing by the fence with 100 questions burning in his mind. What did she mean by something different? What kind of future did she imagine for herself? And was there any possibility, however small, that he might fit into that future? The other ranch hands had noticed his attention to Violet, and they were not subtle about their teasing. Better watch yourself, Harding, said Tom, a grizzled hand who had been working ranches since before Russell was born. Boss is not going to take kindly to one of his workers sniffing around his daughter. I am not sniffing around anyone, Russell protested, but his face heated anyway. I am just helping with the mare. Tom laughed, a dry sound like wind through dead grass. Sure you are, boy, sure you are. Just remember that Morrison has big plans for his daughter. Plans that definitely do not include a cowhand with nothing but the shirt on his back. Russell knew Tom was right, but it did not change what he felt. He could no more stop his heart from racing when Violet smiled at him than he could stop the sun from rising each morning. He tried to keep his distance, tried to focus on his work, and stop inventing excuses to be near the pen where she worked with Mercy. It lasted exactly one day before he found himself drifting back, drawn like iron to a magnet. Violet was sitting on the fence rail, her legs dangling, watching Mercy graze peacefully in the afternoon sun. She looked up when Russell approached, and her face lit up in a way that made his chest ache. I was hoping you would come, she said simply. Were you? The words came out before he could stop them, carrying more hope than he intended to reveal. Yes, I wanted to ask you something. She jumped down from the fence, landing lightly beside him. How did you end up here? In Cripple Creek, I mean. You do not sound like you are from Colorado. So Russell told her about Texas, about wide skies and endless plains, about his father's ranch and the drought that had ruined them, about the men who had come to take the land and the way his father's heart had simply given out from the grief of it. He had never told anyone the whole story before, but somehow with Violet it all came pouring out. Years of buried pain and loss finding release in the late afternoon light. She listened without interrupting, her dark eyes never leaving his face, and when he finally fell silent, she reached out and took his hand. I am sorry, she said, and he could hear that she meant it, that she truly understood the weight of what he had lost. It is not fair, the way life takes things from us without asking. Her hand was warm in his, and Russell knew he should let go, knew that touching the boss's daughter was dangerous and foolish, but he could not make himself do it. Instead, he held on, memorizing the feel of her fingers, the calluses she had earned from working with horses, the strength in her grip. What about you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What brought you back here instead of staying in Denver? Surely there was more opportunity there, more of the kind of life your father wants for you. Violet's expression turned fierce. Denver was suffocating. Everyone so concerned with appearances, with saying the right things and knowing the right people. I felt like I was being slowly erased, like they were trying to turn me into someone I was not. My mother understood. Before she died, she made me promise that I would not let anyone dim my light, that I would stay true to who I really am. Her voice caught slightly on the word died, and Russell squeezed her hand without thinking. She passed 2 years ago. My father sent me to Denver 3 months later. I think he did not know what to do with me, with a daughter who refused to mourn quietly and prettily. "I am glad you came back," Russell said, and it was the truest thing he had ever spoken. Violet looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "So am I," she whispered. They stood there for a long moment, hands clasped, the world narrowing to just the two of them and the space between their bodies, charged with possibility. Russell wanted to kiss her more than he had ever wanted anything, but he forced himself to step back, to release her hand, to remember who he was and who she was and the impossible distance between those two realities. "I should get back to work," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Violet nodded, but he could see disappointment flicker across her face. "Of course. Thank you for telling me about your family. It means a lot that you trusted me with that." Russell walked away before he could do something stupid, like pull her into his arms or tell her that he had fallen in love with her the moment he heard her singing to a frightened horse. But the feeling stayed with him through the rest of the day, through supper and the evening chores, through lying awake in the bunkhouse staring at the ceiling while the other hands snored around him. He was in love with Violet Morrison, completely and hopelessly, and there was not a damn thing he could do about it. The next morning brought trouble in the form of a man named Gerald Sutton, who arrived at the ranch in a fancy carriage with polished brass fittings. Russell was working in the barn when he heard Morrison's booming voice welcoming the visitor, going on about how pleased he was to see him, how he should have come sooner. Curiosity got the better of Russell, and he positioned himself where he could see out the barn door without being obvious about it. Gerald Sutton was everything Russell was not. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in expensive clothes that screamed money and status, with perfectly groomed hair and a smile that showed too many teeth. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire life, and when Violet emerged from the house, Russell saw Sutton's eyes light up with possessive interest. "Miss Morrison," Sutton said, taking her hand and bowing over it in an exaggerated gesture. "You have grown even more beautiful since I last saw you. Denver clearly agreed with you." Violet extracted her hand as quickly as politeness allowed. "Mr. Sutton, this is a surprise. I did not know you would be visiting." "Your father invited me," Sutton said smoothly. "We have some business to discuss, and he suggested I stay for a few days so we could all get reacquainted." Russell's stomach dropped. He did not need to be a genius to figure out what was happening. Morrison was playing matchmaker, throwing his daughter at a wealthy man who could advance the ranch's fortunes. The realization made him feel sick. Over the next 3 days, Russell watched from a distance as Gerald Sutton courted Violet with all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. He brought her flowers, expensive chocolates from Denver, a book of poetry bound in leather. He accompanied her on rides around the property, though Russell noticed that Sutton's horsemanship was mediocre at best. He sat next to her at dinner and dominated the conversation with stories about his mining interests and his connections to important people in the territory. And through it all, Violet maintained a polite mask that revealed nothing of what she was really feeling. Russell tried to stay away, tried to focus on his work and ignore the jealous rage burning in his gut, but it was impossible. He found excuses to be wherever Violet might be, torturing himself with glimpses of her laughing at something Sutton said or walking beside him through the ranch yard. The worst part was that he had no right to feel this way. He was nothing to her, just a ranch hand she had been kind to, someone she talked to occasionally. She had never promised him anything, never suggested that she felt the same magnetic pull that kept him awake at night. On the fourth day of Sutton's visit, Russell was working in the separate pen with Mercy when Violet appeared at the fence. She was alone, and her face was tight with stress. "May I join you?" she asked, her voice formal in a way it had not been before. "Of course," Russell said, opening the gate for her. Violet stepped inside and immediately went to Mercy, wrapping her arms around the mare's neck and burying her face in her mane. The horse stood perfectly still, as if sensing that her person needed comfort. Russell waited, giving Violet space to gather herself. "My father wants me to marry him," Violet said finally, her voice muffled against Mercy's neck. "Gerald Sutton. He has not proposed yet, but father has made it clear that this is what he expects. He says Sutton is a good match, that he can provide me with security and status. He says I am being foolish and romantic if I think there is any reason to refuse such an offer." Russell felt like someone had punched him in the chest. "What do you want?" he managed to ask. Violet lifted her head and turned to look at him, and Russell saw tears streaming down her face. "I want something real," she said fiercely. "I want someone who sees me, really sees me, not just the ranch I come with or the connections my father can provide. I want someone who understands why I sing to frightened horses and does not think I am crazy for believing they have feelings. I want someone who tells me about their pain and trusts me with their truths." She paused, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I want you." The world stopped. Russell was certain he had misheard, that his desperate heart was playing tricks on him, but Violet was looking at him with such raw honesty that he could not doubt what he had heard. "Violet," he said, and her name felt sacred on his tongue. "I am a ranch hand with nothing to offer you. No land, no money, no prospects beyond the next day's wages. Your father would never allow it. Hell, he would probably fire me just for standing here talking to you like this." "I do not care what my father allows," Violet said, stepping away from Mercy and moving toward him. "I am 22 years old, not a child. I make my own choices about my life." "It is not that simple," Russell protested, even as every fiber of his being wanted to reach for her. "You are used to comfort, to having what you need. I could not give you that. We would be starting with nothing." "Do you love me?" Violet asked, stopping directly in front of him, so close he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. The question hung in the air between them. Russell could have lied, could have protected them both by denying what he felt, but he had never been good at lying, and he could not bring himself to start now, not with her. "Yes," he said, the word coming from somewhere deep in his soul. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you singing to that terrified horse. I have loved you every moment since. I will love you until the day I die." Violet's face transformed with joy, and then she was kissing him, her hands coming up to frame his face, her lips soft and insistent against his. Russell froze for half a second before his body caught up with his heart, and then he was kissing her back, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her close, years of loneliness and loss melting away in the warmth of her embrace. They kissed like people who had been waiting their whole lives for this moment, like they were trying to make up for all the time they had not been together, like they were sealing a promise that words could never adequately express. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Russell rested his forehead against hers. "What are we going to do?" he asked. "We are going to figure it out," Violet said firmly. "Together." But figuring it out proved more complicated than either of them anticipated. Gerald Sutton proposed 3 days later at a formal dinner Morrison had arranged, complete with the ranch's wealthiest neighbors as witnesses. Violet refused him as gently as she could, citing her need for more time and her desire to remain independent. Sutton took it with surprising grace, though Russell saw the flash of anger in his eyes before he masked it with a smile. Morrison, however, was furious. The shouting match between father and daughter carried across the entire ranch yard. "You are being a foolish, romantic child," Morrison roared. "Sutton is offering you everything any woman could want, and you are throwing it away for what? Some ridiculous notion about love." "Yes," Violet shouted back, her voice just as strong. "I am refusing to marry a man I do not love, a man who looks at me like I am a prize to be won rather than a person with my own thoughts and feelings. Mother would have understood. She would have wanted me to marry for love." "Your mother filled your head with nonsense," Morrison said coldly. "And look where it got her. Dead at 43, worn out from trying to make this ranch work while holding on to stupid ideals." Russell, listening from his position in the barn, heard Violet's sharp intake of breath, heard the silence that followed Morrison's cruel words. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but carried clearly in the evening air. "If believing that people deserve respect and kindness is nonsense, then I am proud to be foolish. I will not marry Gerald Sutton, father. Find someone else to sell to the highest bidder." She stormed out of the house, and Russell stepped back into the shadows as she passed. He waited until she reached the pen where Mercy was kept, then followed at a distance. Violet was crying, angry tears that she swiped at impatiently as she climbed over the fence. Mercy immediately came to her, nuzzling against her shoulder in comfort. "He really wants you to marry Sutton," Russell said quietly, announcing his presence. Violet whirled around. "I do not care what he wants. I meant what I said, Russell. I want a life with you, whatever that looks like." "We should leave," Russell said, the idea forming even as he spoke. "Not just the ranch, but Cripple Creek entirely. Head somewhere we can start fresh, where your father cannot interfere." "Where would we go?" Russell thought about it. "Wyoming. I heard there are ranches up there looking for experienced hands, and some of them will hire married couples to work together. It would not be easy, but we would be together. We would be free to build something of our own." "Married," Violet repeated, and a smile broke through her tears. "Russell Harding, was that a proposal?" Heat flooded Russell's face. "I suppose it was, though not the kind you probably imagined. No ring, no fancy words, just a promise that I will spend every day of my life trying to make you happy." "Then yes," Violet said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you. When do we leave?" They planned carefully, knowing they would only get one chance. Russell had saved most of his wages over the past 2 years, not having much to spend money on beyond basic necessities. It was not a fortune, but it would be enough to get them to Wyoming and support them until they found work. Violet quietly packed what she could carry, focusing on practical items rather than fancy dresses she would have no use for on the trail. They decided to leave on a Sunday, when most of the ranch hands would be in town and Morrison would be distracted with his weekly poker game. But 3 days before their planned departure, Gerald Sutton showed up again, and this time his friendly mask was gone. Russell was near the main house fixing a broken porch rail when he heard raised voices coming from Morrison's office. "I do not take kindly to being refused," Sutton was saying, his voice hard and cold. "Especially not by some girl who does not understand the realities of the world. You owe me money, Morrison. A lot of money. I invested in your ranch expansion with the understanding that I would be marrying into the family. If that is not going to happen, then I want my investment back, with interest." There was a long silence. Then Morrison's voice, sounding older and more tired than Russell had ever heard it. "You know I do not have that kind of cash available. Everything is tied up in land and livestock." "Then I suggest you figure out a way to convince your daughter to reconsider," Sutton said. "Or you can start selling off your precious land piece by piece until the debt is paid. Your choice." Russell's blood ran cold. This changed everything. If Morrison lost the ranch because of Violet's refusal to marry Sutton, she would never forgive herself. And if Sutton had a financial hold over Morrison, he could make their lives hell even if they tried to leave. He found Violet in the barn, brushing down one of the horses. She took one look at his face and put down the brush. "What happened?" Russell told her everything he had overheard. Violet's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "That bastard," she whispered. "He set this up from the beginning. He loaned my father money knowing it would give him leverage, knowing he could use it to force me into marriage." "Your father should have told you," Russell said. "Should have let you know what the stakes were." "My father probably convinced himself that it was the best solution for everyone," Violet said bitterly. "Marry me off to a wealthy man, solve his financial problems, and not have to deal with his difficult daughter anymore. 3 problems solved with 1 wedding." She leaned against the horse, her shoulders sagging. "Maybe I should just do it. Marry Sutton, save the ranch, let you go on to Wyoming without me." Russell stepped forward and gently turned her to face him. "Do not even think that," he said fiercely. "I do not care about the ranch, and neither should you. Your father made his choices, got himself into this mess. That is not your responsibility to fix by sacrificing your entire life to a man who would use debt as a weapon." "But if the ranch is lost, all the people who work here will lose their jobs," Violet protested. "Jack and Tom and everyone else. What happens to them? They will find new work, same as we will," Russell said. "Ranch hands are always needed somewhere." "But there is only one you, Violet, and you only get one life. Do not waste it being miserable to solve someone else's problems." Violet pressed her face against his chest, and Russell held her tightly, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his. They stood like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other. "We leave tomorrow night," Violet said finally, lifting her head. "Not Sunday. Tomorrow. Before Sutton can do anything else, before my father can try to convince me it is my duty to save the ranch." Russell nodded. "Tomorrow night. I will have everything ready." They spent the next day in a state of tense anticipation, going through the motions of their normal routines while secretly preparing for their departure. Russell checked and rechecked his supplies, made sure his horse was well fed and rested, and managed to acquire a gentle mare from a neighboring ranch for Violet to ride. He told the rancher he was buying the horse for a friend passing through, paid cash from his savings, and hoped no one would connect it to their flight. Violet packed her bags and hid them in the barn, saying goodbye in her heart to the room she had grown up in, to the memories of her mother that lingered in every corner of the house. As the sun set on what would be their last day at the Morrison ranch, Russell felt a mixture of excitement and terror churning in his gut. They were really doing this. They were running away together, choosing love over security, betting their futures on each other. It was reckless and irresponsible and absolutely the right thing to do. He was in the bunkhouse pretending to sleep when he heard the soft tap at the window. Carefully, trying not to wake the other hands, Russell slipped out of his bunk and grabbed his bag. He had already led the horses to a spot a quarter-mile from the ranch buildings, far enough away that their departure would not immediately be noticed. Violet was waiting outside, dressed in practical traveling clothes, her face pale but determined in the moonlight. They walked in silence until they reached the horses. Then Russell helped Violet mount before swinging into his own saddle. He looked back at the ranch one last time, at the dark shapes of the buildings silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and felt a pang of something like regret. He had been happy here, or as happy as he could be while carrying the weight of his past. But that life was over now. A new one was beginning. They rode through the night, pushing the horses as fast as they dared on the rocky mountain trails. Russell had mapped out a route that would take them north toward Wyoming while avoiding the main roads where someone from the ranch might easily track them. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see by, and the horses were sure-footed and willing. Violet rode well, keeping pace without complaint even though Russell knew she must be exhausted. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they stopped beside a small stream to rest the horses and eat some of the food Russell had packed. Violet sat on a flat rock, her legs stretched out in front of her, looking more relaxed than Russell had seen her in days. "You think they have discovered we are gone yet?" she asked, tearing off a piece of bread. "Probably," Russell said. "Your father might send someone after us." "Let them come," Violet said with surprising fierceness. "I am done living my life according to other people's plans. I chose you, Russell. I choose this, whatever comes next." They reached the territorial border into Wyoming 4 days later, tired and sore but still together. Russell found a small town called Laramie where they were married by a justice of the peace in a ceremony that took all of 10 minutes. There was no fancy dress, no flowers, no gathered family to witness their vows. Just the two of them standing in a dusty office, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived. When the justice pronounced them husband and wife, Russell kissed Violet with all the tenderness and passion he had been holding inside, and felt her kiss him back with equal fervor. "Mrs. Harding," he murmured against her lips. "Mrs. Harding," she agreed, and smiled like sunshine breaking through clouds. They spent their wedding night in a modest hotel room, learning each other's bodies with gentle exploration and building desire. Russell had been with women before, brief encounters that meant nothing beyond momentary pleasure, but this was different. This was Violet, his wife, the woman he loved more than life itself. Every touch felt sacred, every kiss a prayer. When they finally came together, moving in ancient rhythm, Russell looked into Violet's eyes and saw his entire future reflected there. Finding work proved easier than Russell had feared. A ranch owner named William Foster was looking for a married couple to manage a satellite property about 15 miles from his main ranch. The job came with a small house, modest wages, and the opportunity to earn a share of the profits if they could improve the land's productivity. Foster was a fair man in his 50s, weathered by years of hard work but still strong and capable. He looked over Russell's references, asked pointed questions about his experience, and then turned to Violet. "What about you, Mrs. Harding? Can you handle ranch life?" "It is not easy out here, especially for a woman used to comforts." Violet met his gaze steadily. "I grew up on a ranch in Colorado. I can ride, rope, work cattle, train horses, and shoot straight when I need to. I am not afraid of hard work, Mr. Foster. My husband and I are looking for a place to build a life together. If you give us a chance, we will prove we are worth it." Foster's weathered face cracked into a smile. "All right then. The job is yours. When can you start?" They moved into the little house the next day. It was small, just 3 rooms with basic furnishings, but to Russell and Violet it might as well have been a palace. It was theirs. For the first time in their lives, they had a home that belonged to them, a place where they could build a future together without anyone interfering or making demands. Violet cried happy tears as she walked through the rooms, already planning where to put things and how to make the space feel lived in. The work was hard, harder than anything Russell had done before. The land was rough and the cattle half wild, requiring long days in the saddle and constant vigilance against predators and disease. But Violet worked beside him every step of the way, proving herself just as capable as any ranch hand Russell had ever known. She could rope a steer, brand a calf, and deliver a breech birth foal with the same competence she brought to training horses. The other hands on Foster's main ranch quickly learned to respect her, and Russell fell more in love with her every single day. At night, they would collapse into bed exhausted, muscles aching and hands blistered, and hold each other close. Sometimes they made love with slow, sweet tenderness. Other times they simply talked, sharing stories from their pasts, dreams for their future, random thoughts and observations about the life they were building. Russell learned that Violet had a wicked sense of humor and a talent for mimicking people's voices that made him laugh until his sides hurt. Violet discovered that Russell could play the harmonica and would sometimes play her gentle melodies while she sang, their music blending together like their lives had. Winter came hard that first year, dumping snow that piled up past the windows and froze the ground solid. They had to break ice on the water troughs twice a day and haul hay to the cattle through drifts that sometimes reached their waists. There were nights when the wind howled so fiercely that the little house shook, and Russell held Violet close, both of them huddled under every blanket they owned, breathing warmth into the space between their bodies. It was miserable and uncomfortable, and somehow also perfect, because they were together. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. The cattle that had survived the winter were thin and needed careful management to regain their strength. Violet worked with the horses, training several young colts that Foster wanted to sell. And in April, Violet woke up one morning and threw up everything she had eaten the night before. At first they thought it was something she ate, but when it happened 3 mornings in a row, Violet started counting days and doing mathematics in her head. Then she looked at Russell with wide eyes. "I think I am pregnant," she whispered. Russell felt his heart stop and then restart at double speed. "Are you sure?" "Pretty sure. All the signs are there. I will know for certain in a few weeks." She bit her lip, suddenly looking uncertain. "Are you happy? I know we did not plan this so soon." Russell crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. "Happy? Violet, I am terrified and thrilled and so in love with you I can barely think straight. A baby, our baby." He pulled back to look at her face, searching her expression. "Are you happy?" Violet's smile was radiant. "Yes. Yes. I am so happy I could burst. We are going to be parents, Russell." They told Foster a week later once they were certain. The ranch owner congratulated them heartily and insisted on reducing Violet's workload, assigning the heavier physical tasks to other hands. Violet protested that she was perfectly capable of continuing as normal, but Russell sided with Foster, and she finally agreed to take things a bit easier. As her belly began to swell with their growing child, Russell found himself constantly amazed by the miracle of it. He would rest his hand on the curve of her stomach and feel their baby move, tiny flutters that gradually became stronger kicks. "He is going to be a fighter," Violet said one evening as particularly vigorous movement rippled across her belly. "He?" Russell asked with amusement. "Pretty sure you are carrying our daughter, based on how stubborn she already is." Violet laughed and took his hand, pressing it firmly against her stomach where the baby was kicking up a storm. "Stubborn runs in both our families. This child does not stand a chance of being anything else." She was right about the stubbornness. When the baby decided to be born on a cold November night, the labor was long and difficult. Russell stayed with Violet the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, whispering encouragement even as he felt his own heart crack open with fear every time she cried out in pain. The local midwife, a competent woman named Mrs. Patterson, finally shooed him out of the room, saying he was making things worse by hovering. Russell paced outside for what felt like hours, listening to Violet's labored breathing and occasional cries, feeling more helpless than he had ever felt in his life. Then, finally, he heard a new sound. A baby's cry, strong and insistent, demanding attention. Mrs. Patterson opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Harding. Strong, healthy boy with a good set of lungs on him. Your wife is tired but doing well. You can come in now." Russell entered the room on shaking legs. Violet was propped up against pillows, her hair plastered to her head with sweat, her face pale with exhaustion. And in her arms was the smallest, most perfect human being Russell had ever seen. His son. Their son. "Russell, meet Robert," Violet said softly. "Robert Harding. I thought we could name him after your father." Russell felt tears streaming down his face as he carefully sat on the edge of the bed, reaching out to touch the baby's impossibly tiny hand. Robert's fingers immediately wrapped around Russell's thumb, gripping with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Russell whispered. "You are perfect. God, Violet, I love you so much." "I love you too," Violet said, and despite her obvious exhaustion, her eyes were shining with joy. "We made this, Russell. This beautiful little person. He is ours." Those first months with a newborn were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, of learning to change diapers and soothe colic, of marveling over every tiny milestone. Russell had never imagined he could love anything as much as he loved his son. Watching Violet with Robert, seeing her gentle patience and fierce protectiveness, made Russell fall in love with her all over again. She sang to their baby the same song she had sung to that terrified horse so long ago. And Robert would calm in her arms, his dark eyes looking up at his mother with absolute trust. As Robert grew from infant to toddler, Russell and Violet continued building their life. They saved every penny they could, working toward the dream of eventually buying their own piece of land. Foster, pleased with their work, had increased their profit share, and after 3 years they had accumulated enough for a down payment on a small ranch that bordered Foster's property. It was not much, just 80 acres with a rundown cabin that needed extensive repairs, but it was theirs, their own land, their own home. The day they signed the papers, Russell picked Violet up and spun her around despite her laughing protests. Robert, now a sturdy 3-year-old, clapped his hands and demanded to be spun too. Russell obliged, lifting his son high into the air until the boy shrieked with delight. "We did it," Violet said, her eyes bright with tears of happiness. "We actually did it, Russell. We have our own ranch." They spent the next year fixing up the cabin and building a proper barn. Russell worked during the day on Foster's ranch to keep money coming in while Violet managed their property and cared for Robert. In the evenings and on Sundays, they worked together on improvements, Russell swinging a hammer while Violet sawed boards and mixed mortar. Robert helped by carrying small tools and getting underfoot in the way only a small child can. Slowly, the place began to look like a real working ranch. They acquired more cattle, bred their horses, planted a large garden that Violet tended with the same careful attention she gave to everything else. Russell built a separate pen near the barn where Violet could work with difficult horses, offering training services to neighboring ranches. Her reputation spread quickly, people marveling at how she could gentle even the most troubled animals with patience and that soft, singing voice. When Robert was 5, Violet told Russell she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and when their daughter was born on a warm May morning, The labor was shorter and less frightening. They named her Victoria, and she came into the world with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. Robert was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to hold her and help take care of her. Russell watched his children together and felt a contentment so deep it almost hurt. The years passed in a rhythm of hard work and simple pleasures. Robert grew tall and strong, learning to ride almost before he could walk, following Russell everywhere and absorbing knowledge about ranching like a sponge. Victoria was quieter than her brother but every bit as determined, and by the time she was 3 she had declared that she would be a horse trainer like Mama when she grew up. Violet encouraged her daughter, teaching her the songs and techniques she had learned from her own mother. They heard news from Colorado occasionally, usually through traveling ranch hands or in newspapers that made their way north. Morrison's ranch had survived, though barely. Sutton had apparently found another woman to marry, someone more willing to exchange herself for financial security. The gold rush in Cripple Creek continued to boom, drawing more and more people to the mountains. None of it touched Russell and Violet. That life felt like it had happened to different people in a different world. When Robert turned 12, he asked his parents how they had met. They were sitting around the dinner table after a long day, the children finally old enough to really understand and appreciate the story. Russell looked at Violet, and she smiled at him with all the love they had built over the years. "Well," Violet began, "it all started with a frightened horse named Mercy and a song my mother taught me." She told them about that day in the corral, about calming the mare while Russell watched from the fence. Robert and Victoria listened with rapt attention as their parents recounted the whole story, taking turns with different parts. The growing love, the obstacles, the difficult decisions, the midnight escape and the journey to Wyoming. Russell talked about seeing their mother for the first time, about how her voice had reached into his chest and grabbed hold of his heart. Violet described Russell's kindness, his quiet strength, the way he had trusted her with his pain. "So you ran away?" Victoria asked, her eyes wide. "Just like in a storybook. We chose each other," Violet corrected gently. "And it was not easy or simple, but it was the best decision we ever made, because it gave us this life. It gave us this ranch, and most importantly, it gave us you too." "Your mother is the bravest person I know," Russell added, reaching across the table to take Violet's hand. "She gave up everything comfortable and familiar to build something new with me. She worked harder than anyone I have ever met to make this ranch succeed. And she has been an amazing mother to both of you." Violet squeezed his hand, her eyes soft. "We did it together. That is what marriage is, what family is. Working together, supporting each other, choosing each other every single day." Robert and Victoria asked more questions, wanting to know every detail, and Russell and Violet answered them all. By the time the story was finished, the sun had set and the stars were bright in the Wyoming sky. Russell looked around the table at his wife and children, at the home they had built together through years of love and labor, and felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. "Papa, why are you crying?" Victoria asked, concerned. "Because I am happy, sweetheart," Russell said honestly. "Because I am sitting here with the 3 people I love most in the world, in a home we built with our own hands, living a life we chose for ourselves. That is worth crying about." As the children grew older and the ranch continued to prosper, Russell and Violet made good on their promise to always choose each other. They had arguments occasionally, disagreements about how to manage the ranch or discipline the children, but they never went to bed angry. They always talked it through, always remembered what they had built together and why it mattered. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Russell took Violet back to the stream where they had rested during their escape from Colorado. They had not been back in all those years, but the place had stayed vivid in both their memories. "This is where I really understood we were going to make it," Violet said, looking around at the familiar landscape. "Where I knew in my bones that choosing you was the right decision, even though we had no idea what would happen next." Russell pulled her close, marveling at how well she still fit against him after all these years. "I knew it the moment I heard you singing to that horse. Everything else was just details." Violet laughed and tilted her face up to kiss him. "You are such a romantic, Russell Harding." "Only for you," he murmured against her lips. They made love there by the stream, their bodies moving together with the practiced ease of 20 years of intimacy. Afterward, lying in the grass with Violet's head on his shoulder, Russell felt the same sense of rightness that had filled him on their wedding night. This was where he belonged. This was his home, not any particular place but wherever Violet was. Robert left home at 19 to work on a larger ranch, wanting to gain more experience before taking over the family operation someday. Victoria stayed, continuing to develop her skills with horses until people came from 3 counties away to have her train their animals. She had inherited her mother's gift, that same intuitive understanding of what frightened creatures needed. Russell watched her working in the pen one afternoon, singing softly to a skittish gelding, and was struck by how much she looked like Violet had that long-ago day in Colorado. "She is amazing," Violet said, coming to stand beside him. "Sometimes I look at her and cannot believe we created something so wonderful." "We created 2 wonderful somethings," Russell corrected. "Plus this ranch, this life. Not bad for a runaway cowboy and the boss's daughter." Violet leaned against him, and Russell wrapped his arm around her waist, a gesture as natural as breathing after all these years. They stood there in comfortable silence, watching their daughter work her magic with a troubled horse, and Russell felt a peace that went bone deep. When they were both in their 50s, Russell and Violet officially signed the ranch over to Victoria, who had married a good man named Thomas, who respected her skills and her independence. Robert had settled on a ranch in Montana with his own wife and children, happy in his life, but always coming home for holidays and important occasions. Russell and Violet moved into a smaller house on the property, built by Russell's own hands with Victoria and Thomas's help. They still worked on the ranch daily, unable to fully retire as long as their bodies held up, but the burden of management had passed to the younger generation. "We did good," Russell said one evening as they sat on the porch of their new house, watching the sun set over land that would belong to their family for generations to come. "We did very good," Violet agreed. She took his hand, their fingers interlacing in a pattern worn smooth by decades of repetition. "I have never regretted it, you know, leaving Colorado, choosing you over comfort and security, not for one single moment, even during that first winter when we nearly froze to death." Russell asked with a smile. "Especially then," Violet said firmly. "Because even in the hardest moments, even when we were broke and exhausted and scared, we had each other. We had love. That was always enough." Russell lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I love you, Violet Harding. I have loved you for 35 years, and I will love you for however many more years we get." "I love you too," Violet said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "My cowboy who heard me singing and fell in love." They sat there as darkness fell, wrapped in each other's warmth and the satisfaction of a life well lived. The ranch around them hummed with quiet evening sounds, horses moving in their stalls, cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of the barn door swinging in the breeze. Inside the main house, they could see lights in the windows where Victoria and Thomas were settling in for the night. Somewhere in Montana, Robert was probably doing the same with his family. The legacy Russell and Violet had built together extended far beyond this piece of land. It lived in their children, in the values they had taught and the example they had set. Years continued to pass, bringing the joys and sorrows that accompany a long life. Russell's hair turned completely white, and Violet's hands became gnarled with arthritis that made some of her detailed horse work difficult. But they adapted, finding new ways to be useful, new roles to play in the family operation. Russell taught his grandchildren to rope and ride, passing on skills he had learned as a boy in Texas. Violet taught them the songs her mother had taught her, the ancient melodies that calmed frightened animals and reminded people that not everything in this world wanted to hurt them. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Robert came down from Montana with his wife and 4 children, all of them strong and healthy. Victoria and Thomas had 3 children of their own, and the youngest was only 7, keeping everyone on their toes with his endless energy. The house was full of noise and laughter, of children running and adults talking, and the kind of chaos that only comes with a large family. Russell stood in the midst of it all, watching Violet hold their newest grandson, her face soft with the same tenderness she had shown with their own babies so many years ago. She caught his eye across the room and smiled, and Russell felt his heart expand with a love so vast, it seemed to contain the entire universe. 50 years. Half a century of marriage, of partnership, of building a life together from nothing but determination and devotion. That evening, after the children had been put to bed and the adults had settled into quieter conversation, Robert stood up and called for everyone's attention. "I want to propose a toast," he said, raising his glass. "To my parents, who taught me everything I know about what love really means. You have shown all of us what it looks like to build something lasting, to stand by each other through good times and bad, to never give up on the promises you make. You ran away together 50 years ago with nothing but each other and a dream, and you turned that into this." He gestured around at the house, at the family gathered there. "Into all of us. We are your legacy, and we are so grateful for everything you have given us. To Russell and Violet Harding, may we all be so lucky in love." Everyone raised their glasses, echoing to Russell and Violet. Russell stood and pulled Violet to her feet, kissing her thoroughly while their children and grandchildren cheered and whistled. 50 years, Russell murmured against her lips, "and I would do every single one of them again exactly the same way, even the hard parts." Violet asked, her eyes twinkling. "Especially the hard parts," Russell said firmly, "because they made us who we are. They brought us here." As the years moved on into their 60s and then 70s, Russell and Violet remained devoted to each other and to the land they had claimed together. They became the family's living history, the keepers of stories that explained how everything had come to be. The grandchildren loved to hear about the midnight escape, about traveling through dangerous territory with nothing but each other to rely on, about building this ranch from raw Wyoming soil. To them, it sounded like an adventure from a book, but to Russell and Violet, it was simply their life, the choices they had made and the consequences that had unfolded from those choices. Russell's body began to slow down in his mid-70s, his joints stiffening with age and old injuries. He could no longer spend full days in the saddle, but he still went out every morning to check on the horses, to feel useful and connected to the ranch that had been his life's work. Violet's arthritis worsened, but she refused to stop working with troubled horses entirely. She just adapted her methods, doing more verbal coaching and less physical handling, teaching younger trainers the techniques she had spent a lifetime perfecting. On a warm summer evening when Russell was 78 and Violet 77, They sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The ranch stretched out before them, prosperous and well managed under Victoria and Thomas's care. Their grandchildren were growing up strong and capable, already showing signs of the same determination and work ethic their grandparents embodied. "Do you ever think about Colorado?" Violet asked suddenly. "About what your life would have been like if you had never heard me singing that day?" Russell considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I cannot really imagine it. Who would I have been without you? Just another cowboy drifting from ranch to ranch, I suppose. No family, no home, no purpose beyond the next paycheck. You gave me everything that matters, Violet. You gave me a reason to build something instead of just surviving. You gave me freedom," Violet said softly. "The freedom to be myself, to live according to my own values instead of someone else's expectations. You saw me, really saw me, and you loved what you saw. Do you know how rare that is?" "How precious." Russell reached for her hand, their fingers automatically intertwining. "I have been the luckiest man alive since the day I watched you calm that frightened mare. That moment changed everything." "That moment was fate," Violet said. "I believe that. I believe we were always meant to find each other, meant to build this life together. Nothing else makes sense when I look back on everything that had to happen to bring us to that exact place at that exact time." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Russell felt a profound contentment settle over him. Whatever time they had left, whether it was years or days, he knew with absolute certainty that he had lived a good life. He had loved deeply and been loved in return. He had built something that would outlast him. He had made a difference in the world, not through grand gestures or dramatic actions, but through the steady accumulation of small choices made with integrity and devotion. "I love you, Violet," he said, the words as true as they had been 56 years ago when he first spoke them. "I will love you beyond this life and into whatever comes next." "I love you, Russell," Violet replied, squeezing his hand. "Always and forever." Russell passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, his hand clasped in Violet's. She held him through the night, singing softly the same song she had sung to that frightened horse so long ago, singing him into whatever waited beyond this life. At his funeral, the church was packed with family and friends, with people whose lives had been touched by Russell's quiet kindness and steady integrity. Victoria spoke about her father's unwavering devotion to her mother, about how he had shown her what real love looked like. Robert talked about his father's work ethic, his fairness, his willingness to take chances for the people he loved. But it was Violet who told the most important story. Standing at the front of the church with her children and grandchildren surrounding her, she recounted that day in the Colorado corral, when a frightened horse and a soft song had brought two people together in a moment that would echo through generations. "He was a good man," Violet said, her voice strong despite her tears. "The best man I ever knew, and he gave me 58 years of the kind of love most people only dream about. Our life together was not always easy, but it was always real. It was always worth it. And I will carry him in my heart until the day I join him again." Violet lived another 4 years after Russell's death, remaining active on the ranch and with her family. She spent her days teaching her great-grandchildren the songs and stories that connected them to their history, making sure they understood where they came from and what had been sacrificed to give them the lives they enjoyed. On quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch and talk to Russell as if he were still sitting beside her, telling him about the ranch's progress and the family's news, keeping him connected to the life they had built together. When Violet's time finally came, It was Victoria who sat beside her bed, holding her hand just as Violet had held Russell's. The old woman's breathing was labored, her body finally giving out after 8 decades of hard use, but her eyes were clear and peaceful. "Do not be sad," Violet whispered to her daughter. "I have lived an extraordinary life. I chose love over fear, and it made all the difference. I am ready to go find your father now. I have been missing him something fierce." "Tell him we are taking good care of his ranch," Victoria said through her tears. "Tell him his grandchildren and great-grandchildren are thriving. Tell him his legacy lives on." Violet smiled, her gaze seeming to focus on something beyond the room, beyond this world. "I will," she promised. Then, so softly that Victoria almost missed it, she began to sing. The song her mother had taught her, the song she had sung to frightened horses and restless babies and her dying husband. The song that had brought Russell Harding into her life all those years ago. As the last note faded from her lips, Violet's breathing stopped, and her face relaxed into an expression of perfect peace. Victoria sat with her for a long time, crying and remembering, grateful beyond words for the example her parents had set, and the love they had shown not just to each other, but to everyone around them. At Violet's funeral, which was even larger than Russell's had been, the family gathered to celebrate a life well lived. The ranch that Russell and Violet had built together now sprawled across several hundred acres, prosperous and productive, employing dozens of people and supporting multiple generations of Hardings. Their great-grandchildren ran through the grass where Russell and Violet had once worked from dawn to dusk, building their dream. The barn that Russell built with his own hands still stood strong, housing horses that descended from the bloodlines Violet had so carefully cultivated. In the small family cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch, Russell and Violet were buried side by side under a simple headstone that read Russell Harding, 1866, 1944 Violet Morrison Harding, 1870, 1948. Together they built a legacy of love years past. And the story of Russell and Violet became part of family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It became a touchstone, a reminder of what was possible when two people truly committed to each other, when they chose love over convenience and built their lives on a foundation of mutual respect and devotion. The ranch continued to thrive, always staying in the family, always managed with the same values Russell and Violet had established in those early hardscrabble years. On the 100th anniversary of Russell and Violet's midnight escape from Colorado, the family held a celebration at the ranch. Dozens of Hardings came from all over the country, all of them descendants of that cowboy and the woman he heard singing to a frightened horse. They gathered around the old barn, and Victoria's granddaughter, herself now a skilled horse trainer, told the story of how it all began. "A long time ago," she said to the children sitting cross-legged in the grass, "there was a frightened horse named Mercy, and a woman who knew how to sing her calm. And there was a cowboy who heard that singing and fell in love right that very moment. He did not know her name. He did not know anything about her except that her voice reached into his chest and grabbed hold of his heart. And that love, that instant recognition of finding your person, built all of this." She gestured around at the ranch, at the family gathered there, at the legacy that stretched back more than a century. Russell and Violet Harding chose each other when it would have been easier and safer to choose something else. They ran away together with nothing but hope and determination. They worked harder than most people can imagine to build this place, and they loved each other every single day for nearly 60 years. That is what real love looks like. That is what we come from, and that is what we honor when we take care of this land and each other. The children listened with wide eyes, entranced by the romance and adventure of it all. The adults stood around the edges, many of them with tears in their eyes, grateful for ancestors who had been brave enough to follow their hearts. As the sun set over the Wyoming landscape, someone started singing the old song, the one Violet had learned from her mother and taught to her children and grandchildren. Other voices joined in, harmonizing, the melody rising up into the evening air like a prayer of thanksgiving. In that moment, the spirit of Russell and Violet seemed to hover over the ranch they had built, over the family they had created, blessing it all and reminding everyone there that love, real love, the kind that takes work and sacrifice and absolute devotion, was always worth it. That sometimes the bravest thing you could do was listen to your heart, choose your person, and build something together from scratch. That the legacy you left behind was not measured in money or land, but in the values you instilled and the love you shared. The story of the cowboy who heard a woman singing to calm a horse and fell in love in that moment lived on, passed down through generations, a testament to the power of love to transform lives and build futures. It reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, you find the person who changes everything, the person who makes you brave enough to choose love over fear, to build something real together, to create a legacy that echoes through time. And that legacy, born in a Colorado corral on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, continued to thrive in the Wyoming ranch where Russell and Violet Harding had made their stand, had built their life, had loved each other with a devotion that time could not diminish and death could not end. Their story was complete, fully lived and fully resolved, a closed circle of love that began with a song and ended only to begin again in the hearts and lives of everyone they had touched. The ranch stood strong under the stars, just as it would for generations to come, a monument to what two people could accomplish when they chose each other, when they worked together, when they never stopped believing in the power of love to overcome any obstacle. Russell and Violet had found their happily ever after not in some fairy tale ending but in the daily choice to love each other, to build together, to create something that mattered. And that, in the end, was the greatest love story of all.